It's 12 o'clock, but let's give a minute or two for our other subcommittee members to join. Any feedback, Sarah or Amy?
Yes, sorry. So Nick is joining. He was having trouble logging in as a panelist, so I'm just going to ask Elizabeth to move him over to panelist as soon as he's logged in. I haven't heard from Larry. And Amy, were you able to get Daryl?
He is going to be on by about 11:15.
Okay.
Also, I just sent reminders to everyone that we're waiting on.
Great. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I was having some problems with WebEx myself this morning, so there may be some weird things going on.
Okay. Well, we'll see here from Larry. He's our newest member of the Accountability Subcommittee, so hopefully he'll be able to get in. We'll be able to, I think, probably move forward, Bob, as soon as Nick.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. So when Nick joined us, we'd go ahead and.
Yeah, that's what I would suggest. And then sounds like Daryl will be joining us in just a few minutes, and hopefully Larry too.
Yep.
Okay, guys, I finally got in.
Okay.
Oh, there's Nick. Hello.
Hey, Nick.
Happy Friday to you.
Happy Friday to you all.
So let's go ahead and get started. I think Daryl's going to join us a little bit later, but good afternoon or good morning, depending upon which time zone you're in. I'm Bob Eby. I'm the Vice Chair of the State Board and also the Chair of the Testing and Accountability Subcommittee meeting. Our subcommittee members include Nick Darnell, who's on, Daryl Cobbins, who will be joining us in a few minutes, and hopefully we'll also hear from Larry Jensen soon too. Larry is our newest member of the subcommittee, and we certainly welcome him. We're also always happy to have other board members, and in particular, our chair, Lillian Hartgrove, is joining us today too. Welcome, Lillian. We have several things to talk about today. Timeliness of this subcommittee meeting is actually is perfect in some respects, with a special session that the governor called on legislative session on education, and then most recently this week issuing the hold harmless bill. So I think we got a lot to talk about, and we're delighted and pleased to have the Tennessee Department of Education here and present to us several topics, and I think Casey Wren is going to lead that discussion. So let me turn it over to Sarah first and see if she has some upcoming, some preliminary comments, and then we'll move forward with Casey.
Not much from me. Thank you, Bob, and members and our team at the State Board and our colleagues at the department for joining us. Like Bob said, I think it's super timely. We're excited to dig in and hear more from Casey and Mike at the department about how fall testing went, how they're preparing for spring assessments, and certainly some conversation about accountability and the recent bill that the governor just put forward yesterday will be super timely. So I won't take up any more of our valuable discussion time, but thank you all for joining us and looking forward to our discussion today.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, well, the first agenda item is the State Department of Education, and Casey, and then I think she's going to be helped by Mike. So go ahead, Casey.
Absolutely. Well, Chairman and members, thank you so much for allowing me to speak with you today. It is so good to see your faces, even if only virtually, and connect on this. And I know I'm excited to give you some updates. We have had a lot of challenges, obviously, in assessment over the fall, but I am incredibly proud of our team at the department, and even more so proud of our district testing coordinators and our educators in the field who have done just amazing work to make sure that we're able to serve students through this challenging year. So I know Sarah mentioned how fall testing went. It is still going. Actually, one of our innovations this year to make sure that we're able to serve our students was to actually expand the fall testing window. So as I'm speaking to you today, there are still districts that are testing and are doing some great work, which you'll hear a little bit more about. So obviously, assessment is the foundation and the fundamental kind of underlying data gathering that we use for all of our programs at the department and throughout our strategic plan. It's how we measure our progress on academics, how we support our educators, and forms the foundation of how we judge our work. And so for the next few minutes today, we'll do a little bit of a look back on 2020. We'll talk about, since I joined you last, the subcommittee meeting last January, the world has changed quite a bit. And so we'll do a little bit of a look back just to remind you kind of where we expected to be at this point, and then how we actually have done the work since that time. We will give you an update on how fall testing is going to date. And I'll also tell you a little bit about our formative work that you got a preview of last January, but is actually now coming to fruition, and that's exciting. And then also share where we currently are with our seniors for our ACT. I know that there's been a lot of great questions and ongoing conversation with board members and board staff throughout the fall. And as we look to the spring, I want y'all to have a clear understanding of where our seniors currently are with that requirement and what that looks like for the semester ahead. And speaking of ahead, that's where we'll end up. We'll talk about how we're preparing for the spring testing windows and what we're sharing with districts and the feedback we're gathering there. And then also tell you about when you will expect to see me again later in the summer to talk about standard setting for our science and social studies exams. Again, something I mentioned last January, but we haven't quite gotten there yet with the cancellation of testing last spring. So we'll talk through that and what that plan look like. So since I spoke with you last January, we had a very eventful March. We talked about the return to online testing the last time we were together. The crux of that was this statewide online verification test that we conducted in March 5th. Unfortunately, that was just 2 days after those devastating Middle Tennessee tornadoes, which left 5 of our districts unable to participate in that. So to date, we have not successfully kind of met the letter of the law there with all of our districts participating in the verification test. And we are currently have plans underway to do alternate additional verification tests this spring. We were able to do successful tests for the vast majority of our districts and who responded very positively and are looking forward to a potential return to online testing in next year or the years following. So just a week after that, though, we started to see the first school closures from COVID-19. And then in the middle of March and toward the end of March, we saw the passage of our General Assembly legislation that did put the cancellation on spring, the requirement for spring testing last year, and also the hold harmless for the results of that data from 2019-2020. We were successful in obtaining the U.S. Department of Education waiver for the cancellation of those assessments, and then very quickly worked to do a stop work order with Pearson, our administration vendor, to ensure that we were good stewards of taxpayer funds as the change in the assessment program throughout the spring. That being said, we did not stop work. So instead of scoring assessments in April, May, and June as we were planned, we very quickly pivoted to plan for formative. And before the end of the fiscal year, we were able to execute a cost option on the Pearson project. Existing contract to launch a formative platform to support our districts. So when we saw the cancellation of tests in the spring, many districts were worried about not having good quality data. following the interruption in instruction. And so we were able to use that time in the summer to develop start of year checkpoint exams that are smaller TCAP aligned exams, but not quite as long as our normal summative, that were deployed the first week in August. And so I'm incredibly proud of our team who worked very quickly to create basically 55 new exams within just a matter of months and deploy those to districts along with the launch of a statewide formative platform. We were able to also continue throughout the summer and fall negotiating new testing options, both for ACT, which you'll hear about a little bit later, but also WIDA access. Our WIDA window was cut short. This is our test for English learners, and they very generously opened up a second window in the fall, which is not part of our traditional contract, to allow us to test additional students to make sure that we were serving students appropriately throughout this school year, which was a huge benefit. We also, over the summer, this was, again, something we talked about in the last January meeting, did continue with the RFP process for our development contract and awarded that contract to Pearson. We now have an end-to-end solution with both administration and development with Pearson, and I will say that it has streamlined some of our scheduling for this year, which is as part of our ability to kind of push out, offer some more flexibilities to districts that we're going to be talking about through the spring. So I'll stop right here and see any questions on the work that has been done since the last time we were together.
Thank you, Casey. Any questions for Casey? I will just say also, people think during COVID, not lots not getting done, and unbelievable what you have done, and the statewide formative platform, getting that going on and everything that you've done. I think it has been a very active, and thank you and the whole department for what you've been working toward.
Absolutely. I will definitely share those notes of thanks with our team. They worked incredibly hard throughout the summer, and I'm very proud of how much they were able to accomplish. So the formative platform you mentioned, that did launch in August and has been operational since then. It is an incredibly easy platform to navigate, and it is all browser-based, which means our schools and districts are able to use this whether they're in school or whether their students are deployed virtually. And so we do have districts that are using it in those ways. And so just to give you a little bit of a preview here, we talked about the start of your checkpoints. Those are those shorter exams that were meant to not necessarily replace the full summative, but to give teachers an understanding of where their students, what topics they had mastered from the previous grade and where they may need more scaffolding and support as they approached new grade level content when students returned for school. We also launched full-length mock interims. So these were launched in the fall for all of our high school and, of course, exams, including math, English, biology, and U.S. history. And in just a few short weeks, about 10 days, they're actually going to launch for all of our grades 3 through 8. Again, for math, English, science, and social studies. So in the past, we've had practice exams. These were not 100% blueprint aligned, and they were only offered as like a PDF version. So teachers had to do a lot of the work of printing those or copying them or using that to actually use them in their classrooms. This way, we're actually deploying them in an online testing environment that will look like our testing environment if we return to online. And so those are full-length exams that students can get realistic performance level indicators on those scores, that again, the team has done a tremendous amount of work to build all of that suite of assessment. Additionally, we are working to release just individual test questions that are aligned to standards that have been previous TCAP items. We are building, slowly but surely building an item bank in SchoolNet that teachers can then use to either test students one question at a time or create their own exams. And the functionality of the platform means that educators can use the platform to create and deploy their own tests, even if those aren't the state provided tests. So a lot of districts, I know, educators are using this particularly to create and give tests for students who may be in a virtual environment that they can assign these tests to. And to date, we have seen over 100,000 tests taken in the platform, and you can see the vast majority of our students across the state are registered in the platform and have accounts and can log in today. So this is a lot of work for our vendor, for our team, but also for our district who have really kind of picked this up. Where we have seen our formative platform the most used are in some of our middle and smaller districts who don't have the resources or capacity to buy larger end-to-end products. And so the folks that have used this have been incredibly thankful, especially for the start of year checkpoint exams, those math and ELA checkpoints starting out early. And so we're excited to get the rest of the mock interims up at the start of the semester and see how the rest of this year goes.
Casey, let me ask a question. Can you say how the districts are using these formative and the mock interims? I mean, are they getting the results? Just the teachers getting the results, the students, and how are they using it to develop their classroom for the year?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know in terms of the capabilities of the platform, teachers automatically get and instantaneously get the results for these tests. They can print individual score reports, and then district leaders and school leaders can also see those roll-ups. And there's a lot of reporting that's built into the platform for school and district leaders to see the results rolled up to that. Now, in terms of how that is being used on the ground, I'll say a couple things. Our team created what we call grading guides that we aligned for every single one of these checkpoint and interim exams. And those grading guides not just outlined, okay, here's the results in terms of like the buckets of red, yellow, green, where your student, what your score was and what that means for your student, but we actually went in depth with every single question and wrote annotations for each question, for each answer choice. And so if a student chose a correct answer choice, we said kind of what that meant in terms of the standards. If a student chose an incorrect answer choice, we actually wrote out where was the likely misconception that student may have had and what this could mean for an educator who needs to then take a next step. And so what we'd like to see is that educators are looking at that. The reporting in the platform actually allows them to identify if there are specific answer choices that are more or less like trends in their classroom. And we hope they're using those grading guides to say, all right, the majority of my kids got these questions right. I don't have to worry about that. But on this question, most of them got it wrong in this way, which means there's a fundamental misunderstanding about fractions that I'm going to have to correct before I start teaching multiplying fractions in my current grade level. And so we're hoping that kind of next step helps connect the dots. Now, in terms of how they're really being used on the ground, I mean, I think I described kind of an aspirational thing. I know that our teachers are using it. They are working incredibly hard, and I think our core team, some of our regional consultants could give you probably better on the ground observations of what they're seeing. But our goal is that they were using those checkpoint results particularly to inform their just-in-time support of their students on grade level instruction, rather than thinking about this in terms of remediation upfront.
No, that's very, very helpful, and I think it's awesome with regard to having the answers with some reason and thought process of, if we give this answer, this is something, this means something. If they give this answer, I think that's great.
I have a question.
Yes, Lillian.
Casey, it sounds like this is an optional tool for usage by the district. So do you know how the training took place so that a decision was made? Did it go to the district level, the central offices, or were all teachers given the opportunity to go through the training? Because I could see a district perhaps saying, this may not be something we think we need to roll out. However, there could be useful tools just listening to or looking at this particular slide and hearing the options for a teacher to utilize it. I'm just wondering, do you know if it got past the district level decision?
Mm-hmm. Obviously, most of these decisions are made at that district level. And so what we did is we provisioned accounts for every educator who was in an assessed class, so a course that had an aligned assessment. And so starting at grade 3 all the way through high school, and of course, if we had a teacher in our data system, our statewide data system, who was teaching an assessed class, we went ahead and provisioned an account. And so those teachers got emails that these accounts existed. Now, whether or not their district organized training and rollout of this in a comprehensive way, those decisions were made at a district level. And so I definitely know some districts that, those building and district testing coordinators got educators together to talk through this. Some districts where that happened with a principal, but there are other districts that again, they had other benchmark assessments rolling and did not do a comprehensive rollout.
Understood. Thank you for that.
All right. So now to the real testing, if you will, but not the optional free formative, but in thinking about our summative end of course testing for the fall. We did not want to go ahead with business as usual, knowing the different on the ground contexts that each of our directors of schools were facing in their communities. And so throughout September and October, we met with superintendent work groups and regional superintendent groups to ask questions about what they expected to see on the ground, where they needed flexibility, where they needed support. And we, through those conversations, identified our most frequently asked questions and concerns. And I will tell you, obviously, the larger concerns were around accountability and participation in the assessments, and worrying particularly about virtual students or about students who had been impacted by the virus, what that would mean for testing. And so in advance of our fall window, we issued pretty comprehensive guidance that would support in-person testing. And so what we did was we talked to district testing coordinators around how they expected to be able to test if they were doing social distancing. What did that mean for their schedules, for the locations that they were using? How many proctors did they need? And so after listening to those questions, we issued guidance that allowed them to use offsite testing locations that they identified if they needed the space, that allowed them to set more flexible schedules to test different things on different days, to not test whole groups with students together if that's what they needed. And we also made sure that they had the training available if they wanted to utilize non-traditional test administrators or proctors, that as long as they went through the exact same training and test security expectations that we've outlined, they were able to do so. We also issued guidance on the use of medical exemptions. So in the past, this is a tool that is normally used for circumstances that are far beyond a student's control. Think a student who gets in a car wreck and is in the hospital the day before testing, et cetera. So these are very specific exemptions. We talked through what COVID quarantine, what COVID diagnosis looks like on the ground, what information local districts would have, worked with the health department to understand how they would get some of that information, and then issued guidance on how they could update their local medical exemption policies to deal with that. I will say that this policy is not something that is held at a state level. These are individual local board policies that deal, just like attendance or grading. The medical exemption is determined at a district testing coordinator level. So we wanted to make sure that those DTCs felt like they had all the information they needed to update those policies that they have in place, and to gather the right documentation for those decisions that they're making. We also provided peer support and profiles. So we actually launched a daily webinar during the testing window, and we were highlighting districts that had done successful things. This was especially helpful as the window went on, and we saw more schools opt to change to virtual depending upon local COVID spread, and how district testing coordinators very quickly adapted their schedules for that, and how they issued makeup tests. We tried to highlight and share those best practices so peers could connect with each other and get some of those questions answered from folks that were actually dealing with similar solutions on the ground. The biggest flexibility we offered was the choice to open up a second testing window. So we traditionally test from the day after Thanksgiving break through winter break. We offered that same window, but we opened up a second window that's currently underway. So this was open January 4th. It goes until the end of next week, the 21st. For two reasons. One, there were districts that started their semesters much later, and those first semesters extended into January. We did not want to cut out instructional time. We wanted to provide the time for those districts to have the same amount of time with those students. And two, because of COVID spread, we did see students who were unable to take a second subpart because of a quarantine, or were quarantined at the beginning of the window but not toward the end, and we wanted to provide time for makeup assessments to, again, get the most participation possible for our districts to make sure that they were serving all of their students as best they could. So that second window is really the largest flexibility that we offered in fall testing right now. And while there's considerations around test security, et cetera, I will sing the praises of our district testing coordinators who have been absolutely phenomenal in thinking through the test security and keeping those materials at district central locations, and really monitoring what this looks like building to building to make sure that we have security across the state.
I might have missed it, but do you know the percent that took it during the December, and then in January? Was it a larger percentage in January, or how that?
Yeah, so over looking at all of the districts that we have to test, and we typically test 80, 90 districts in the fall, 6 districts offered to only test in January. And so those were the districts that started their semesters later and wanted to wait until the end of the semester to test. Now, that being said, another 40 districts are using this second window for makeup exams only. So for students who were potentially quarantined during part of the testing window, who may not gotten to finish all of their tests, they are still using this window for makeups. And so I believe, we were planning that was about an 80-20 split, but we did have significantly more makeup scheduled for this second window than we even thought going in to the first window. So this is what the first set of numbers looks like. Similar to last year, over 100,000 secure test materials were printed. And remember, our administration vendor is sealing these booklets by hand to make sure that we've got test security across subparts. Thousands of boxes were shipped to districts to fulfill those orders. And in the December testing window, we saw over 63,000 tests taken. Now, last year, that number was north of 80,000, so you can see about where we are compared to last year. But again, this was incredibly strong participation for what we saw. So district to district, we are seeing north of an 80% participation rate, although that varies drastically depending upon where our districts are in the COVID process. But as I spoke to before, I'm incredibly thankful for the hard work of our DTCs and training our proctors, et cetera. We have had no tests. I should knock on wood because I have another week, but we have had no security breaches or tips submitted to our test security tip line to date.
Casey, I know you talked about the participation based on, the situations. How is the participation in Shelby and Davidson? I know those are systems where their schools are still completely virtual, whereas I think most everybody else in the state is at least hybrid. So what are we seeing as far as participation in Memphis and Nashville?
That's a great question, and actually it leads me to something that I have not told you all yet, and that is when we offered the two windows in the fall, we also offered the option for districts to postpone their fall testing all the way until spring. And so Metro Nashville was actually one of the districts that decided to postpone to spring because they had been all virtual for their high school students. They knew they would be remaining virtual for their high school students, and they wanted to make sure that they were giving the opportunity for the community spread to come down for those students to come back in the classrooms before they issued those exams. So Metro Nashville has not tested yet. For Shelby County, Shelby has very limited testing in the fall. Typically, we see those are their alternative schools, some of their high schools that are on modified schedules. So it is not all of Shelby County that participates in the block schedules, and they are currently testing right now. So I can't speak to their participation rate if they still have another week to complete those assessments. They were one of our districts who decided to test later because of their later start in the fall.
Did Nashville and or Shelby do significant formative testing in the fall to kind of know where the students were, or you know?
I can't speak to that mainly because they both have, well, I can speak to it as a mom. I do feel like Josephine had extensive formative testing in Metro, but they have pretty impressive systems that they have already purchased and so they are using with their students. They were not necessarily using the SchoolNet platform, given the fact that they had already had their benchmarks in place. We do not look at their local assessments for that, so I can't really speak to what that looks like other than, what I experienced with my own daughter. All right, so successes that we've seen in the fall, active partners, I can't sing the praises of our district testing coordinators enough. They've participated in daily webinars throughout both testing windows to hear best practices and troubleshoot. Pearson has been an excellent service partner. They have maintained a customer support level of 100% throughout these windows. Last year, that was in the high 80s, and so that's definitely been an improvement. This year, they have continued to support our districts. Flexibility. I know in those first conversations with directors of schools in the fall, there was a lot of questions and potential frustrations and a desire to do this right and keep kids healthy. And we have tried to respond as best we could, and I think directors and district testing coordinators have been incredibly thankful for that partnership and that flexibility. But I think what we have seen in the fall has definitely led to lessons learned and updates for the spring. And shipping and scoring, our districts worked very quickly. They took test security very, very seriously, and we were ahead of the game this year compared to last year in terms of how quickly they delivered their materials back to Pearson and how smooth that kind of scanning and scoring process was. But we definitely had some challenges, obviously. Remember, we started testing right after Thanksgiving. The first week was very smooth, but as we moved into the second and third week, we saw an increase in COVID quarantines due to exposures following the break. And so while the window progressed, we saw more schools going virtual, and that made in-person testing more difficult, which is why we saw the increase in students moving to the second window for makeups late in the window. And just the challenge of navigating two windows, ensuring accurate student data across that time as students are moving between. That was some new steps for our team, for the IT team, and for Pearson. And I will say that while that's been challenging, I think we are navigating that to date. So this is where we currently are. This is the second fall testing window. I mentioned the 6 districts that are testing completely during this window, and another 40 that are using it for makeup exams. Daily webinars are continuing, and again, we have had no test security or issues to date. We have already delivered the raw scores and the first set of scale scores to districts from the first window. Raw scores for the second window are expected to arrive in early February. And again, many schools are still virtual due to COVID. So we'll see a lot of this testing getting squeezed into next week, or we are still offering the opportunity to move students into the same window for makeups if districts so choose. The final results of both windows will be put together, and so as we deliver those district reports, those will come in early March. So before we move on to ACT, any other questions about the fall window and where we are currently?
Any questions for Casey?
All right.
Go ahead.
ACT. So obviously, as we talked about back in March, we typically test our juniors in the spring. There are 3 testing dates that we normally select for our juniors in the spring. And unfortunately, our juniors last year, only one of those dates was prior to the statewide school closures. And so many of our large districts had already shut down by that date, that March 17th date. And so these were predominantly small and or rural schools who went ahead with ACT testing in the spring on that first date of March 17th. Only about 1,700 students were able to test on that date before the school closures and the cancellation of the rest of the spring testing for ACT. We worked very quickly with ACT to issue vouchers for summer testing to districts who requested that. Again, that was a little bit of a moving target throughout the spring and summer as national test dates were canceled or testing sites were moved depending upon the spread of COVID. And so only about another 825 students were tested in the summer on national test dates, dependent upon what that looked like. So that's obviously not where we normally are after the spring and summer. And so our fall retake opportunity, again, we offer multiple dates in the fall for, this is typically used as just our senior retake. But for this class, most of these students, this was the first time they had taken the ACT. And so we offered 3 in-school days, just as we normally do. Those fell toward the end of September and through October. Most of our districts, all of our districts participated as they normally would have. Even our districts who were virtual for high school, including Metro and Shelby, selected one of those days and brought students physically in the buildings to test. And so while we did see lower participation there than normal, we do have across the state a pretty impressive participation rate for our fall test. I prepared and sent these slides early on Wednesday night. I got the final profile report from our fall testing, and actually I have a slightly higher number for you that after I sent these slides. So the number at the bottom of this slide, this 58,000 number, when I got the final profile report on Wednesday night, it's actually 59,770 students. Which equates to 87% of our cohort, of our senior cohort, was able to test in the fall. And just to put that in context, last year in our fall testing, we tested just over 56,000 students. So we actually tested 3,500 more students this fall than we did last fall, and that is the highest number we have ever tested in the fall testing program in Tennessee. And so that's, you know, nearly 9,000 more than our very first time we tested in the fall several years ago. And I know I'm like a broken record today, but this is the great work of our district testing coordinators and our leaders on the ground to implement these test in such an uncertainty, and to get more students in the buildings than even they have in normal years. So just really impressive work that we're able to see 87% of the class was able to take one of these tests in the fall. So we are still committed to providing 2 opportunities to test for our students. That is the intention of the dual track of our funding in our ACT program, and we still want to make good on those promises to students. Districts have received vouchers for all of their students for the entire cohort for national test dates throughout the fall and leading into the winter. And so we know that there are students who are taking advantage of those vouchers and are continuing to test, and those data are rolling in as national test dates go throughout the year. ACT, I have also been, while we were very firm and critical with them at the beginning of the pandemic, I have been impressed with how they have stepped up and responded to our requests. They've worked to expand testing sites across the state. In the past, we do have multiple districts, multiple counties who are situated in a place where they do not have a national testing center in their county. And so for students who are must test on a national test day, that means driving, it means taking time off work, it means traveling. And so we were very critical and worked very hard with ACT to say, how can we fix this, right? If we're only providing some of these national dates, how can we fix some of these locations? And so ACT actually offered high schools the ability to become national test sites, but offer closed sessions, meaning their school didn't show up on the national registration page for anyone to select, but only showed up with students who had a code. And that meant we were able to kind of recreate that in-school testing experience for students who normally would have had to travel across county lines to go to a national test site. We were able to kind of create that in-school testing experience with their normal high schools without a lot of external folks driving in and being there that they weren't aware of. And so those dates have continued from October and December. I do not have the full results from those December test dates yet, and so we're not sure how many students have been able to take advantage of that, but we're watching that closely with ACT. So as I speak with you today, there have already been 11 opportunities for our senior cohort to test, some of whom tested in March, some over the summer, some in our fall testing, and then some in closed session testing on national test dates. But there will be more. So looking toward the spring, we have another 24 remaining opportunities. And the bulk of those opportunities are available because in our spring testing program, ACT does allow online testing, which means instead of just picking one day where you have one paper form, there's multiple windows where students could test on a computer online throughout that entire window. And so we're encouraging high schools to think through this. It allows for social distancing of students if you're thinking about testing students on multiple days instead of in one room on one day. We hope that expands participation in the spring. And so there's another 3 in-person testing days in the spring that are through our junior program, as well as the days that would be associated with online testing. So a lot more opportunities in addition to more national opportunities where their vouchers will still work. And so we're confident that we can kind of continue to nudge up this participation rate. But I'm very proud of our districts for really hustling this fall. We are already at an 88% participation rate for this cohort. So between the spring, summer, and fall testing, the data that I have to date says that over 60,000 of our 68,000 seniors have already tested on ACT.
In your retesting dates, how does the mix come between people taking the test for the first time versus people taking the test? How does that? I'm just thinking of how you're going to get to your next 7,000 or 8,000 or something.
Right. That's a great question that we're actually currently looking at. So remember, I said we just got our final profile report like Wednesday night. We're literally just now digging into the data from our fall. Traditionally, ACT we have had, how do I say this politely? We have had to do a lot of the matching work ourselves in terms of connecting students who have taken a test on our in-school date, which we do pre-ID labels. We know those students, they're logged in our information systems, and then students registering for that on a national day. Maybe they use a middle initial instead of a middle name. Maybe they use a different number or call their high school something slightly different than in our system. We have to do that work of matching those students internally, and so that does take some time. And so I don't have a total number for you yet in terms of a deduplicated count. But what we have right now is of the students that I know about in our cohort, more than 60,000 of them have valid test scores that we've received. Now, whether or not that was their first or their second, we're still working to kind of compare those data across the different things. And I expect we'll get more, once our December national test dates are concluded, et cetera. So unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for you, but we hope to.
I do have one question. Casey, do you know what the participation rate was prior to COVID, for the previous cohort of seniors? Do you recall?
I should have brought that for you today. It is north of 90%. I can look for the official numbers. Remember, we do expect a 95% participation rate in our accountability. Most of our districts worked very hard to get to that, and so we can get you those full participation numbers.
And that's why I asked, because I wanted to see where we are in comparison to last year's percentage. The other thing, too, is in thinking about this cohort group, so we're talking about seniors that are actually enrolled, that districts can account for, the systems can account for. They're not lost or missing, or so it's truly, we know who they are, we know where they are. So it's just a matter of different circumstances that occurred that would have prevented them from taking the test thus far. Okay. So we hope that barring any other unforeseen circumstances, that students are out sick or whatever the case may be, that we would have a much higher percentage, because we know where these students are. They're not missing. There was just something that happened that would not allow them to take that test previously, the ACT, correct? Something about the ramifications of ready graduate indicators and things of that nature that we'll clearly have to look at, and we'll talk about later in, I think, our last agenda item.
So, traditionally, that spring junior testing is where we see the bulk of our students taking the ACT, right? We have a far greater participation there than fall normally. And because that's where our students are kind of built up throughout their high school experience to take the ACT. With the cancellation of that last year, it really changed the dynamic for this cohort. And so while our districts did an incredible job to get more students testing in the fall than we have ever done, that still doesn't kind of make up in a situation where many of our schools were completely virtual. And so convincing families and parents, to bring students in, it's a very different situation than in the spring when, the bus picks you up and drops you off at school for a normal day and you take the ACT. And so we're working very hard with our districts, but of our cohort that's accounted for, this is where we are.
I appreciate that, and I know that everybody's been working very hard to get those numbers up and get those students tested. So I just wanted to be able to level set us and put this into perspective, especially as we think about the effects later on when it comes to those accountability measures and ready graduate.
Just to kind of piggyback on what Lillian was asking there, Casey, forgive me, but ACT is a graduation requirement for this year's seniors, correct? I mean, we were able to waive that provision last year, given the timing of the pandemic and the need for those rising seniors at the time, potentially to have that provision waived, but it is a requirement this year, correct, for rising seniors?
I do like
see Amy pop on and on.
Not quite, Sarah. So Public Chapter 652 of 2020 stated that the students who were in 11th grade last year were not required to take the 11th grade assessment for post-secondary readiness, which in Tennessee is the ACT. Based on conversations with our legal counsel, with Angie, and conferring with Christy Ballard at the department as well, the state board's ability to make the ACT a graduation requirement rests on that the underlying statute that says all students must take a post-secondary readiness assessment in 11th grade. Given that the General Assembly waived that for students who were in 11th grade last year, mostly this year's senior cohort, it is not technically a graduation requirement for this year's seniors, although it is strongly recommended, and we very much support it because it does unlock post-secondary opportunities, both in terms of admissions and scholarships. So very much appreciate the work that Casey's team is doing, but also want to be clear that because of PC 652, it's not something where diplomas should be held up if students who were in 11th grade last year did not end up taking it.
Gotcha. Yeah, thanks. I think I'm living in a time warp, but that's right. I wanted to make sure that we had that point clarified in terms of what is statutorily required for this year's seniors versus the situation we were in last year. So that's helpful, Amy. Thank you for getting that on the record. And then I just had one sort of logistical question in terms of the online ACT option that you mentioned, Casey. Is that still something that a student would have to be in a school building to take? That's what I thought, but just in terms of proctoring, that's not something that's available in the home setting. But it's, yeah, okay. Gotcha.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that we have seen some national programs who have started to use remote proctoring. ACT is not one of them.
Okay, that's what I thought, but just helpful to clarify. Thank you for all of this good information. I'm glad the numbers are really ticking up.
Yeah, we were really pleased. After that very first of our 3 fall days, we were nervous, and we worked really hard to support our districts through the second and third day. The third day was definitely our largest, and we were able to see this high participation rate, which we're very thankful for. All right, so looking forward to spring. So following fall, last year we did the same thing. We have done deep dives and understood lessons learned from fall that we can use to make changes for spring. Changes include we're continuing to refine our state data platform to ensure accurate student provisioning. So the data that we provide Pearson and that serves to ID student documents, we want to make sure that as we're moving students between testing windows and changing schedules amidst the pandemic, that we're still able to produce as clean and accurate data as necessary in advance of students taking the test. So rather than having students hand bubble, we are identifying every document in advance to make sure that scoring is fast and accurate. Changes to test administrator manuals and building testing guides. So we, in terms of that guidance that we heard from fall, we have seen how building testing coordinators have adapted to that. We have made sure that we're clarifying and putting specific details in their guides to make sure that they have the most accurate and up-to-date information as they start testing in the spring. We have continued to expand our testing windows to provide choice to districts who have different instructional schedules. So we have districts whose calendars are all over the board at this point, and we want to make sure that we're providing flexibility for districts to maximize instructional time while also being able to participate and test all of their students in the safest way possible. We have also offered individualized technical assistance for schools and districts for ACT and for WIDA, including we've actually expanded our WIDA testing window for this spring by multiple weeks to give, again, give our districts the most time that they need to conduct that testing safely. So we conducted another round of conversations with our directors of schools. I was metaphorically on the road to our regional study council meetings and our executive council of directors of schools talking about what went right and where they still needed flexibility from fall. That has gone into the influencing of our spring testing schedules, which we are still making sure are evolving to meet the needs of our districts. So I just mentioned we expanded our WIDA access testing window. We just got notification literally this week. The final consortium vote, I think, for our alternate testing, our MSAA alternate testing is next week. And it looks like the consortium is also expanding our MSAA testing window, which is exciting. And in terms of our in-house, our TCAP window, we are providing, normally we provide one testing window that lasts about 3.5 weeks. This year we are providing 4 different options for windows for students and for districts to choose based on when they started their semester, when they're ending their semester, how much instructional time they need. I'll also point to this third bullet point as brand new, and this is even different from fall. So what we heard when we announced that we were going to be offering multiple options for the spring testing window is that districts said, well, Casey, I really want to choose a later window to maximize my instructional time for my early grades, but I don't think I can do that because then my high school tests overlap with AP tests, with dual enrollment tests, with CLEP and IB, and I really want to make sure that all my high schoolers have the time to focus on TCAP. So we're going to have to choose an earlier window. And so my team very quickly responded to this. They worked with Pearson to say, nope, you know what, let's go ahead and break apart these administrations. So a district could test their high school students early and continue to use that instructional time if they wanted to on a later window for their grades 3 through 8 or grades 2. So we are seeing districts who are choosing 2 different options here. Again, we wanted to offer as much flexibility as possible to expand the participation rates and maximize instructional time. So I'm very excited about that. Today is the final day for our districts to choose those windows, and so I'll have more information in the coming weeks about what the breakdown of those window choices look like. And then finally, we've talked about the launch of SchoolNet and our checkpoint and interim exams. This spring, we're actually releasing some more new formative tools, the little tiny tests we're calling testlets that were actually focused on very specific standards in math and ELA in just a couple of grade levels. This is a pilot to see how these smaller tests we're going to be hearing feedback from teachers, and then we'll expand for more formative tools next year. So I'm excited about those. Those will kind of go live toward the middle of the semester, in addition to the checkpoints and interims that the districts already have on board. I think the focus here right now is to try and pilot and prototype as much as possible to get feedback from districts. We really want to make sure that we're listening to educators. I think one of the very first questions was, well, how are these being used on the ground? And we want to hear that. We want to hear the feedback, what's working about the platform, where can we make continued tweaks. And these small tests are going to be hopefully much more quick and easy for educators to use. And we really want to hear directly from them as we continue to expand our formative platform, which hopefully for districts means they can spend less money purchasing these off the shelf and know that they've got formative tools that are aligned to our Tennessee standards.
Have you had any feedback from the districts yet? And if so, what are they saying about it?
Yeah, so obviously when feedback gets passed all the way to me, it's the good kind, right? So we do have several directors of schools that are incredibly thankful for the robustness of the reporting in SchoolNet and how quickly they were able to access those tests and know that those tests are aligned to Tennessee standards. Those questions were vetted by Tennessee teachers, and they have data that they can compare to real TCAP. I think we have heard questions around how am I provisioning students. I think the training question that Lillian raised earlier is something that we're also hearing feedback on in terms of producing more support for districts to do some of that training. So can we make some videos and one-pagers and get out more tools for them to do that training? So far, I think that the reaction to the platform has been really positive for the districts that are using it. One of the things that I think is really interesting as we're looking at those 100,000 tests and how they break down is when we saw a district go in to use the checkpoints, we saw them using those checkpoints from head to toe. So they were going from 3rd grade all the way up, and they were testing every single one of their students. And so we didn't see districts that are just doing only 3rd grade or only 7th. When they went in to do it, they were testing everybody. And so I think that speaks to using this in a systemic way to make plans for their scope and sequence, and we were really pleased about that.
I know that one of the complaints that, there's been for years is that it takes so long to get stuff back. And by the time that you receive any kind of data, it's too late for that group. There's no way to adjust. So I think this is fantastic. The more tools that we can put in the hands of our teachers to do those benchmarks, to see real-time feedback, so that we can make those adjustments before it's too late. So congratulations to your team, and I really do hope this is a success, because I think a lot of teachers would use it because it appears that it's a good tool to put in your toolbox.
Absolutely.
And one follow-up question to that, because I don't think I asked the question earlier, Casey. How many districts are actually using it?
That's a great question, and I'll get back to you. I think we have. I don't want to tell you the wrong number, so let me go and pull. I do know of those 100,000 kids. It is not evenly distributed across the state. Obviously, we are seeing our more rural and smaller districts using that more frequently, but I can get y'all a total number.
Because I'm just sitting here wondering if it was clearly understood, and it may be. And there could be factors that are unknown to me why a district would not use them. But based on the fact that you can see information, as Nick described, that in years past, all the years past, it came way too late for the districts and the schools to know how they could go back with the students and rectify whatever learning losses occurred and they didn't learn, they weren't proficient, and so on and so forth. So I'm just wondering, maybe you have information you can share today, but if not, perhaps follow back up with us and let us know.
Absolutely. So we do get those files. I have a dashboard I can look at, and so I can pull that up and send out a follow-up after today.
Thank you.
And Lillian, I can speak to, at least for our districts in the first, most of our districts had already signed a contract with a benchmarking company. And so we had done that before a lot of this was ready, and especially with the third through eighth tests not really ready to go at the beginning. I know that a lot of our districts have already chosen to move forward this year, but I think in the future, we could save so much money and be able to invest that into many other things if the state is going to provide, a reliable tool.
Thank you for sharing that, Nick. That helps a lot. Thanks.
So what to expect over the next few months? A longer overall testing window. So I told you we had 4 options for districts. Those options stretch all the way into June. So our last districts end their school year, June 10th, June 15th, June 12th. And the commissioner made a commitment early on that they could test the last few weeks of their year in order to maximize instructional time. So we will see our window open when it traditionally does in the middle to late April, and then extend all the way into the beginning of June. And so that will require increased support from our department staff, a stronger focus on test security and precautions across the state as we see those different windows. And then changes to the results return date. And so this year is a very difficult year in that we normally, part of the way we're able to push results out a little bit sooner is by equating on a representative sample of our state. Because we will have districts that won't test until the end, it's going to be really difficult for us to get a sample early on. And so our districts will receive raw score files within weeks of making sure of the end of their testing window, but we'll have the comprehensive scale score files in the summer. Will come after we conclude all of our testing windows. And so I think that's important that we're splitting that up to make sure that we're delivering raw scores early for the districts who need it, but then making sure that we're taking the time to really do high quality equating for the reliability of our assessments year to year. I think that'll be really important this year as well. Any other questions about fall testing, ACT spring testing before I head into something else?
Let me ask the question. When you get those raw scores, or you get the test results back, of course, I know you look at overall all the scores, but do you, just like on your formative, you look at questions and you have answers, do you look at specific questions within the test to determine, hey, this is something that the whole state is missing, or this doesn't align? I mean, do you get down to that level of detail in evaluating the meaning of the test?
Mm-hmm. So overall, the answer to that question is yes. However, we don't get down to that level of detail at the time of raw scores, because in reality, at that point, we're just trying to push out those final scores to be used in grades. We have not kind of done a deep dive of how the trends, for example, now, except for in our quality check process. So I will say we have a key check and adjudication process that's going on as we're scoring the exams, meaning if a question is behaving differently than we would expect, maybe no one's getting the question right, or different students are selecting things, we do have a quality check process to really go in and evaluate on an item-by-item basis if we see an issue. But we're not providing, say, a summary report of standards at the raw score point. That comes later after we do our scale scores.
Thank you.
I don't want to get out over my skis talking about the complexity of the statistical analysis there, but there's a lot of work that goes into it. I'm very thankful for our psychometric staff on our team and the Pearson team as well. All right. So standard setting, we had originally talked about bringing you some standard setting work and decisions. I wanted to make sure you got a pretty thorough preview of that in advance of what you're expecting to see later on. So I showed you this slide the last time we talked when we were talking about the cost associated and the timeline associated with creating our assessments, but I'll bring it back up to date to just remind you that standard setting comes toward the very end of our multi-year assessment cycle, and that we start with our standards. We work those standards into blueprints and specifications for our test. We develop our test questions, field test those questions to make sure they're high quality before we use them to actually judge students' mastery. Then we go through, create our real test. We administer that real test, and then we stand back and say, okay, now let's look at each of these from a content perspective and from a student breakdown perspective and say, where do our students demonstrate the level of mastery demanded by our standards? And this standard setting process is important because it leads to our ability to actually produce those scale scores. So while without standard setting, I can give you a raw score. You got 49 out of 55 right. What does that mean? Am I proficient? Well, it depends on the questions, and so that's the standard setting process that we'll talk through today. So standard setting is just a term that we use to describe the methodology of defining our levels of achievement. And so folks can use the term proficiency or the term grade level, and we want to make sure that definition is the same standard from year to year. So that level of expected proficiency means the same thing if students are taking a test in a different year or different test forms across the year. And so those standard setting process is how we determine the cut scores that put students in those buckets of levels of achievement. So in the state of Tennessee, these are our levels of achievement. You know them very well now. Mastered, on track, or our proficiency, meaning they've crossed into that proficient standard, approaching, and then below. And so the process, what goes into this process is a clear understanding of the student expectations, which starts with our standards. How does a student, what is a student expected to know and be able to do in the Tennessee state standards? How is the assessment designed to measure that? What are the actual questions look like? And what is that level of measurement in comparison to specific standards? And then frankly, we really need content experts to evaluate that and set those lines critically. And those content experts don't just know our standards, but they know our kids. And I think this is really important to think about what this looks like in the state of Tennessee and where our Tennessee students are in the process. So in laying those kind of buckets of performance levels across the full spectrum of student performance, as we're looking at scale scores, we need to determine where those cuts are that would effectively differentiate between students in each of the levels of performance. So that standard setting process is really to determine the difference, the cut point between a student who has extensive understanding and a student who has comprehensive understanding and a student who has partial understanding. And these are our policy level descriptors of what it means to be in these policy level definitions. And so the reason why this is important is because tests are slightly different year to year. We have new questions that are coming every year. And some of those questions might be slightly harder or slightly easier than the year before. And we want to make sure that year to year, what we say a student is on track, that exact same level is comparable to the year before and the year after, even if we see slightly different questions coming in and off of the test. So we are preparing and undergoing currently, we're in the middle of standard setting for 2 subjects right now. The first one is science. As you all know, because you were deeply involved, many of you, our state adopted brand new science standards in 2016. Those standards were based on a framework for K-12 science education. And why this is important is because we went from a linear group of content standards to thinking about teaching science as a multidimensional approach. And so you're not just teaching very specific content facts, but you're also teaching practices, trends, standards that would build on each other, that students are expected to develop practices of scientific thinking over time and apply that to the content. And so this multidimensional framework really changes the way that we think about our tests, not just our standards, but how we assess them as well. And so those standards went in place in the 18-19 school year, which means the first test to test them came the year after, which was last year, the 19-20 school year. We were excited about that first operational test, which was field tested in 18-19 and operationalized last year. Unfortunately, because of the spring cancellation of tests, we are at a slightly different spot than we thought we would be. Social studies is in a similar situation. Those standards were revised, although not drastically. So our science standards were pretty drastically changed. The social studies standards were tweaked slightly in the revision. And in terms of our test design, we actually made some test blueprint design changes that we thought more accurately reflected those standards. But because we changed kind of the makeup of the questions of the test, we thought that it was best to go through a standard setting process again for social studies to reset those cuts and make sure that they aligned with these new standards. So we were all set to conduct these operational tests last year, bring educators together last summer, and do our full standard setting committees last summer. And we talked about this last January when I was with you all. Unfortunately, all in-person meetings that the department was going to conduct over this year were canceled. And so we did not actually get to pull this group of teachers together last summer as we expected. We also did not have student testing data, which we normally use to look at during these processes. And so the previous methodology that we have used for standard setting is called a bookmark method, where we take a test that students have taken and we actually rearrange the questions in an order from easy to hard, right, by level of difficulty. And then we have the educators go in and put bookmarks where they think those proficiency cuts should be on that test. And so for those of you who were on the board years ago when we did our cut scores for math and ELA, you would remember those images, I'm sure, of the bookmarks. But that methodology is, you have to have student data to even conduct that methodology. And so we were at a situation where we were thinking very critically about, is that the right methodology to use at this point, and how do we conduct these standard setting in a way that makes sense, given the COVID year that we are in currently. And so we thought a lot about this, and we've had a lot of conversations with our technical advisory committee. These are a group of psychometric and testing experts that advise us on our summative program, as well as our psychometric team on our assessment administration and development vendors. We talked a lot about how do we best set our standards for our science exams in particular, especially because of this multidimensionality of the exam. Each test question is not just asking a specific content piece of knowledge, but is also asking students to apply some of these scientific practices, like evaluating trends or reading charts or graphs or modeling. And so if a student gets a question right or wrong, it may not be because of just the content alone, but because of these practices or vice versa. And so we wanted to think critically about how do we best capture the expectations of a student in our exams in a content-based way. And there's a few reasons for that. One, we did not want our scale and our expectations for students in the state of Tennessee to be based on a year in which we knew students had received a different amount of instruction than they typically would. And we wanted to be very thoughtful that we're setting our standards based on our standards for the state of Tennessee. And we're setting our expectations for our students based on what we believe that they should know and be able to do, regardless of what this school year looks like. And so we decided to move to an Angoff methodology for standard setting rather than a bookmark methodology. And this is a methodology that actually does a laser focus into the content of the state standards and has educators actually compare each individual test question to the language of the standards, and say, where in this standard, what level of proficiency does this specific question demonstrate? And does a majority of students that would fall in this performance level or this performance level, would they get that question right or wrong based on the language of the standard? And so this, instead of lining up the questions in order of difficulty, we're actually looking individually at questions and saying this yes, no, right? Would a student who was below get this right? Would a student who was on track get this right? Because there is a variety of expectation for our students and thinking through how they can demonstrate that expectation across the board. And so the switch to this methodology means that we can have this conversation without student data. We can look at the test questions and at the standards and making sure that we are setting the expectations for our students that is based on what Tennessee has set, right? These are Tennessee state standards. They're not going to be based on some other benchmark. We are going to look at the actual language of our standards that's been carefully crafted by our educators, and we're going to have our educators review these test questions one by one and match those in a way that we'll feel really good about. And so we actually conducted the first set of these meetings, and at the end of November, we normally do these meetings in person because you want a lot of debate. You want good quality conversation around the standards. And we debated if that was going to happen without being in a room together. But we actually were very impressed at the amount of planning and effort that Pearson put into designing a platform that allowed educators to come together on screen while also interacting with test questions in a secure way in order for those really rich conversations to happen. And I can tell you, I popped in on those rooms, I sat in on those conversations, and I have never seen more engagement with a group of adults on a virtual call. It was quite impressive. And so what they did was they looked at fall and spring assessment items and they compared them to our standards and our policy level descriptors. They used this yes, no, Angoff methodology to really hone in on what they thought that those raw cut scores should be. Now, I will say this: we were hoping to get this done and buttoned up and to you. However, we have not yet been able to hold our alternate assessment meetings, and so we are looking at the methodology for that. And our technical advisory committee has recommended that we supplement the NGOF methodology with student profiles for our alternate assessment. That's because those students, they're able to reach our standards, they just learn in slightly different ways. And so we really wanted to make sure that we were prepared to have those conversations and include the student profiles. So we have not yet had our alternate standard setting for science and social studies yet.
Go ahead, William.
On the previous slide, the one you just were reviewing, roughly how many educators are included in the process? And I don't know if you said this, is there an alignment process included in this, that if you don't have agreement, what level, if it's a below average student or, so on and so forth. Did you have alignment? Alignment, I would imagine you had to have alignment, but I'm sure it's built into the training that the educators went through. But again, roughly how many?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, you're absolutely right in terms of the training. They go through pretty extensive training on the front end, and so these meetings are week-long meetings, and the first 2 days are dedicated to learning the methodology, to understanding, to doing a deep dive in the performance level descriptors. So the actual language of the standards, the language of the PLDs. They spend days on that before they even look at test questions. So there is a lot of training in order to make sure that we're all in agreement with what the standards, how a student should demonstrate a standard before they ever look at questions to see have they demonstrated that. So there is pretty extensive alignment work happening, but there's also more that happens later. So I'll tell you a little bit more about what we're going to do after this first meeting on the next slide. But these educators are actually groups. So they're groups of 6 to 8 educators for a given grade level in subject area. So for science and social studies, you think about the different groups for 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th grade. So there's multiple educators, and then they come together in slightly larger groups for vertical alignment across the grades. So there would be a group of 3rd grade teachers and 5th grade teachers that come together to look at how 4th grade then connects 3rd and 5th. So overall, there is dozens of teachers involved. I can get you total numbers, but you're looking at 6 to 8 per grade level per subject area.
That's sufficient. Thank you.
So it seems to me that this NGOF method is a pretty comprehensive method. I'm glad to hear about the alignment. But how do you compare the results of the NGOF versus the bookmark from the standpoint will there be a shift one direction or the other, or is there comparison so that the results are, there's some statistical reason that you don't get a big jump in results or a big lowering of results? How do you make that shift?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I will answer this with two kind of overarching points. The first point is we don't expect that this test and these standards to look exactly like our old test and our old standards. So we don't necessarily want those, the percentage of students in each cut, for example, to look the exact same, because our standards are different now and we're measuring them differently, and they have different things. I would say that's particularly true in science, where we have a drastically different view of what it means to be on grade level, because we're adding in this multidimensional layer of practices. And so we actually expect that there to be some difference there, because that's the whole point of doing the standard setting process, is that we have new standards. And so we expect that those could look different from the past. And I would say, as we're looking at the future for math and ELA, we would consider bringing this method into math and ELA as we're going forward. We want to make sure that we're continuing to learn. Research on these methods is continuing and ongoing, and so we want to use the best that we can the time when we conduct these. So I expect when math and ELA come back up, we'll be having these same conversations about choosing the right method for that and honing in. So I do expect that there would be some differences. Now, in terms of how do we compare and how do we make sure there's not a big jump? That's actually a perfect transition to my next slide. So thank you. In that, you know, these are different teachers that come from all over the state. And I should have said that earlier. We conducted a pretty expansive recruitment and application process. And these teachers had to go through multiple levels. They actually had to complete projects for us so we could see their level of demonstration of knowledge of the standards. And we went through a pretty extensive recruitment and selection process throughout last spring and summer. And we wanted to see diversity in those educators. We wanted to see representation across our state, rural versus urban, our east versus west, and making sure that we had educators that were newer educators and also educators that had been teaching for a long time. And make sure that we see a representative sample of the types of students and the types of schools that we have in our state in the room as we're having these conversations. But these are just 6 to 8 people, right? And they will disagree about things, and they are just a few educators in terms of our tens of thousands of educators across the state. And different rooms may look different. And so the next step in this process is actually what we call vertical alignment, to make sure that we're not seeing, say, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and then, wow, the difficulty, you know, you expect a lot more right answers in 6th grade, and then it's back here for 7th and 8th. We want to make sure that there's some consistency across. And so part of this is we actually do want to see, do we expect, how are our students doing on these assessments after we have set these cut scores, and seeing, do we see articulation across grade to grade based on the recommendations of our educators? And so we want to make sure that, you know, we have a large group of teachers involved, but those teachers, you know, they're different across grade levels. We want to make sure that those recommendations are consistent across the board. And so we will use student data this summer after the spring test to see, is it shaking out how we expect, or is there some anomaly perhaps in one grade level that we can see with a vertical alignment? And so we actually will have another round of educator meetings where we'll bring back kind of the leads, the team captains, or table leads, except for they weren't all sitting at the same table. We'll bring back those table leads to review the results across the vertical grade levels. Hopefully, does that answer your question? I think we do.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I think you're still going to probably, when you look at data across year to year or the last few years, you'll probably have an asterisk there that says changed from one process to another process, because
that's right.
Like you say, you don't expect it to be the same. I think what you're going to is, like I say, much more comprehensive, and it sounds like it's, you know, kind of kicking it up a level, but you probably will have to have an asterisk that explains that.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think you want to make sure that we understand when our TCAP tests align to which set of standards and what that looks like. Absolutely. So we will also have more educator meetings. Our special education teachers will come in and join our content folks for our ALT standard setting meetings. We want to have a mix of teachers here. So again, we have the science experts in the room with our experts on our students taking the alternate assessment. And so those folks together will do a similar process to look at our alternate science and social studies. And then we will expect to bring a full set of recommendations and recommended cut scores to you after testing concludes and after these remaining educator meetings are conducted this spring and summer. I know this is a little bit more meaty and technical of a presentation than earlier ones, but I would love to know if you have any specific requests or Frankly, if you'd like to observe any of these meetings in the future, that's also an option. We do ask our technical advisory committee members to pop in and make sure that these meetings are being conducted as we've planned them, and that these conversations are really engaging. They've been impressed to date with Pearson and their facilitators, as have we. But we're looking forward to finishing up the rest of these meetings and getting those full scores to you.
As an engineer, I wouldn't mind sitting in just watching.
Especially doing it virtually, you can pop in from anywhere. Don't have to come into Nashville.
Any other questions for Casey this time? Okay. Do you have more slides?
No, I think that is it.
Great. Any other questions or comments for Casey?
Excellent. Great job.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for letting me take so much of your time today. And we'll get those two other pieces of information to you on our ACT participation and the district for formative. Get back to you.
Yeah, outstanding. Very, very helpful, very thorough. Gave us a lot to think about, and as we move forward collectively together. Thank you.
Thanks, Casey.
Okay. We have a scheduled break here for about 5 minutes. Is that right? And then we'll come back and go to our individual discussions.
Thank you.
Great.
Okay, get started again. This next session is sort of discuss accountability concerns, and particularly with the hold harmless bill that came in yesterday. And I understand Jack Powers is online also. If we have some questions specifically associated with that, there he is right there. I'm going to turn this over to Sarah for any upfront comments that she might have, and then hopefully the board members have had a chance to read this, and we can talk about it and just accountability in general. So, Sarah.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Bob. No, as we said at the beginning of our meeting, this is very timely given the governor's recent announcement about the proposed legislation. And thank you, Jack, for joining us. I'm sure members will want to just hear from you in terms of what that bill entails. We've shared it with our members, and my understanding is that it does a lot of the things, Nick, that you were putting forward in the resolution that you brought to the board a few months ago, but grateful for the chance to talk through it in a little bit more detail. I think just on the front end of the conversation, my biggest questions, I think, as I read the bill are around the public reporting of data. And, you know, I understand that we're going to be holding districts and teachers harmless essentially from the data. But if you, as we kind of walk through it, can talk to us a little bit about what scores will be generated and shared in what way versus sort of, you know, what we think about as more traditional accountability measures like the A through F and teacher evaluations and that kind of thing, I think will be important to understand. So I'll toss it back to you, Bob, in terms of if you want to have Nick or anybody else speak before we talk through the legislation, maybe in a little bit more detail.
Sure. I've got a couple of questions associated with it, but let me ask other board members, subcommittee members, if they've got something that they want. Nick, you know, you're the one that brought together the resolution, which I think we most of us signed on to and thought that it was certainly the thing to do. And I think this is responsive to that. You got any comments? Is Nick back?
Hey, sorry, Bob, I missed that. I just came back.
Okay. We were just talking on the accountability. The hold harmless bill has many things in it that the resolution that you proposed to the board that we passed and approved. Many of the parts of your resolution turned out in this hold harmless bill. I don't know if you've had a chance to read that bill yet or not, but if you did, do you have any comments or questions associated with it that you want to talk about?
I've been able to read a summary, and so I'm just very thankful, you know, that a lot of the concerns that educators had have been listened to, and I just think it, you know, would be a very difficult year to explain how, you know, why we would hold people accountable with so many variables and so much sickness and in different situations. So I appreciate the governor and the legislature. Hopefully next week we'll get this passed, and also appreciate the timeliness. This is not something that's going to be delayed until later and keep people wondering. This is going to be something that's hopefully going to be taken care of next week. So that people will have some answers. So thank you to all involved in that process.
Thank you, Nick.
And I have a follow-up just regarding some of the other components of accountability, like chronic absenteeism and things like that that are not really covered in the bill, graduation rate and elements like that. So just would like to know what we're expecting and planning with regard to those particular measurements, which we all know districts have worked, school principals, lots of people have worked very hard to find students who are simply missing. They move, they're homeless. There are a variety of factors that are really exacerbated by the pandemic. So it's not mentioned in this bill to my knowledge, and I don't know if we've talked about it in some other place, but I don't recall that conversation. So I'd like to know about that, what we're thinking there. And we always talk about this every year too, and this year, of course, will be very similar to last in that AMOs, we've talked about this before, and there's always this expectation that try to get them out earlier. And there's always struggles. So I think with the pandemic, we're looking at that probably similarly to the way we did last year. But again, to put it on the table, just to be sure that we're not missing something. And I think that's predominantly it for me.
Good questions, Lillian. Jack, do you want to address those? Or?
Yeah, certainly. I'd be happy to. So, I mean, the extent to which this legislation touches on some of those federally required accountability mechanisms, I think you specified, certainly the ones that we capture in our ESSA plan. There is a section of language here at the very end of it. It's actually at the bottom of the second to last page that reads, to the extent authorized by federal law. And this is referencing post-secondary readiness assessments, but I think it's applicable too in terms of, and I see Mike on here too if he wants to offer any extra comment. But some of that stuff is, we would have to seek a waiver from the Federal Department of Education if we wanted to address that. So this legislation speaks specifically to some of the accountability mechanisms that are built into the state code.
Yeah, and what the bill's offering is holding schools and districts harmless for accountability, like any accountability thing. So all the elements that we collect every year, that we report out, they won't be used to create some kind of accountability score for districts. So, just as we will continue to collect and share with folks information and data from the school year, we won't be using that. Whether it be TCAP or other, if they are held harmless.
I think what Jack was saying, if it's under the federal law, we have to get waivers from the federal government before we can add those into our hold harmless. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's a great point, Bob. We will, obviously, like, this is all if a bill passes, and then if we get permission from the feds.
Right.
Well, and that's why I want to be clear too. What is not mentioned in the bill, or which could be subject to interpretation, that we have it on a list, that you're keeping track of, so that we're not in violation of ESSA at this federal level, and we haven't asked for a waiver. Does that make sense?
I think so, Vice Chairman Hartgrove. It does make sense in this case, and I apologize if I got your title wrong in the context of this accountability subcommittee meeting.
But I'm not even a member of this committee.
I apologize.
No, that's okay. Because
we let her join us if she wants to. So.
I care deeply about the subject matter.
I guess I bestowed an honorary vice chairmanship on you.
I think that should be Nick Darnell.
Everyone can be vice chairman, but Chairman Hartgrove, we're very in tune with all of the requirements from the federal side, and definitely have a running list of those in Mike's shop, and are prepared to take action as necessary. I mean, what Mike said is absolutely right about this particular bill. It's fresh off the presses, and we kind of have to let this move its way through, not get ahead of the General Assembly, because this was crafted in partnership with the governor's office and the General Assembly. And Casey touched on this a little bit earlier, just related to that 95% participation rate with ACT. I mean, some of this data is also still kind of playing out. So, of course, we're kind of waiting to see what we'll need waivers for and what we won't. But to answer your question, we are keeping a detailed list of what those items are.
Well, I figured that you were, but I still wanted to make sure that I asked the question just so that we understand exactly how that's all going to play out, especially since not everything is covered in the bill.
Sure.
Nor should it necessarily be included. Thank you.
I had a technical question and I had another comment, but under like section 12, it says if 80% or more of the LEAs or public school charters enrolled in grades 3 through 12 participate in the TCAP, blah, 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 notwithstanding any provision, blah, 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 identify as a priority school to assign a school to the achievement school district. What is the 80% number? I mean, is that applicable here, or do we need 80% in that? Or help me out. And I did not go back to the original law, so can you help me on the 80% number?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, what that's referring to in terms of the actual 80% in assessment is that 80% of students took all the assessments that they were required to take, that they're slotted to take. I want to make sure that's clear. And then in terms of like why that comes into play. I think, again, I'll defer to the fact that this is in part crafted by the General Assembly. I don't want to speculate on their intent in terms of what that actual 80% number is. But what I will say is, just at a very high level, we wholeheartedly agree and believe in the importance of having as much testing data as we can to help parents inform their decisions, to help our educators inform their decisions, and craft like future efforts towards learning loss and remediation. So that's what I can say about the 80%. But again, to clarify, it does refer to 80% of students taking all of the assessments that they're on track to take. So for example, if it's fourth grade students, that they took all of their TCAP assessments that a fourth grade student should take.
Yeah. I understand. So when I read that, and first let me say, I'm all about also thinking we need to take tests. I know there's some people out there saying, we don't need to take tests. If you don't know where you are, you don't know how to get where you want to get to. And so I think, personally, I'm not speaking for the board or anybody else. I think testing is important.
Sure.
But I don't understand on that one. It says if 80% of them, then they shall not be used to identify schools or priority school or whatever. That implies that something less, you could still be identified as a priority school. Or I just don't see how the 80% is applicable. That probably in the past is a law that says 80% take it and they don't score to the certain satisfaction, then they will be identified as a priority school. But just seems to me, it just says you ought to just say if won't be using TCAPs to identify if a school should be a priority school or not, instead of the 80% number.
Sure. And again, not wanting to speculate on their intent, the intent behind putting the 80%. I think what you're getting at is there does seem to be a narrow set of conditions under which a school potentially could still receive, conditions under which some of this data could still factor in. Is that kind of what you're asking about?
Well, yeah. And if I go up, above a number, section 17. I'm on the wrong page. Top of page 5, if 80% or more of the LEAs or public charter schools enrolled in grades 3 through 12 participate in the test, then notwithstanding subsection student performance and student growth data generated from TCAP shall not be used to assign a letter grade to a school. That implies that if it's less than 80%, you could use TCAPs to assign a letter grade. And I don't think that's what the legislation means. But if I read that, that's what it says. So my question is why do we even have the 80% in there? It should say that, our goal is for testing. We want to get as many tests, but this year it'll be held harmless and it won't be used to identify a letter grade unless it builds it up. I don't know.
Sure. And, one thing I'll point out is that right below that in B, it does say that, the commissioner may, at the discretion of the commissioner, waive that as well. So I think that's important to mention.
I saw that. Of course, that means that the commissioner's got to take another action, and maybe that takes care of it. But that was just as I read through it, something that seemed a little inconsistent or had questions associated with it. So.
Sure. And again, like I said, I think the intent is to try and craft a framework, or the intent was to craft a framework to where we have student assessment data available to make those really important decisions. And so I think that's kind of I think that this language is a reflection of that, the importance of at least having the data to make important decisions with.
Yep. Okay. And this is another comment that I have, and really has nothing to do with this bill, but as I read into the bill, I visited the Woodmore Elementary School down in Chattanooga a few months ago, which was a priority school, and it was on the list to come off the priority school if we had TCAPs last year, and they're doing really, really well. But one comment that they made, which I thought was very valid, and that is that when you come off the priority list, then all the extra funding that gets associated with coming off that list gets cut off immediately. And they were telling me, they said, look, we brought in all this intervention. We're using this intervention. It's done really, really well for us. And we understand We're delighted to be able to come off the list when allows them to come off the list when the scoring does, and I said they're ready. But what we would prefer to do is slowly reduce that, maybe 25% the first year, 50%, as opposed to going top to bottom, just losing everything, because they said, I don't know how we're going to respond if we lose all the funding associated with the intervention. We may be back on the priority list the year next. I know this has nothing to do with this bill, but I think it's something that we need to look at collectively and let our legislators know that, hey, is there some way that we can gradually bring them off the priority list so it's just not an instantaneous drop? Just a comment.
And I'm going to jump in, and Bob, I know you've shared that with us before, and it would seem to me that for anybody to go forward in addressing that, we would have to have a better understanding of all the mitigating circumstances that would prevent them from staying off the priority list. So they received the initial assistance, and I would think that they've learned a lot through that process of being on the priority list, and all those key learnings wouldn't go away. But so I'm just sitting here thinking that there would have to be an evaluation, I don't want to say research, but an overview and understanding of why that would be necessary, why that would be the case. And I know you heard it from one school, and it may very well be true of all priority schools. So I think we'd have to understand why that is the case to understand.
I think what they look at is with those intervention dollars and all, they've hired people who have come in and who are providing that intervention. At least this is the way I understood it. And so when they lose that money, they don't have the funds to continue using that intervention. And so they're going to have to let those people go. And so where they've been staffed to the level that's providing the resources to get them the scores, et cetera, then all of a sudden within one year, they lose all that support staff. That was the way I understood. But I agree. We need to look into more details, et cetera.
Bob, Chairman Eby, I was going to say that's a really, really, insightful comments there. I'd be happy to connect you with someone in our school improvement office to help kind of better frame your understanding of what might be happening, like at the district to district level. I'd be happy to do that. And then, of course, as you mentioned, potential legislative action. I don't know if I see Mr. Nathan James on the call or not, but that would also be an important thing to maybe follow up with him on.
Absolutely. It's not anything we're going to do here, but it's just like I say,
it's a good point.
It made a lot of sense when I heard that it's something that collectively we ought to look at. And if it is an issue, we really brag about bringing schools off priority lists. That's great success. Lists don't just turn it around and cause them to go back on it. So I would like to talk to your the individual or something. Just feel free to call me. Thank you, Sarah. You had a comment?
No, I was just supporting your insight, because I do think, again, it goes beyond the purview of this committee and of the board, really, but just thinking about more of a graduated release of funding dollars for these, fragile schools who make great improvement. But to your point, a lot of their improvements are based on some of those additional resources. I think we really, as a state, just need to look at that in terms of kind of giving a little bit more scaffolding to their exit.
Right.
Again, and I think Jack's right, we should talk with folks like Eve Carney and others who are in the school accountability or school improvement business. But great point, I think, to look into further.
Other comments or questions for Jack or Mike or anyone else with regard to the hold harmless bill?
I have a couple comments and then a couple questions. And again, I apologize for not being able to be well versed in the bill yet. But, in conversations with teachers, administrators, and directors, there are two things that are consistently shared with me. One of those is the hold harmless, for both growth and accountability with such a difficult year, and also the 95% testing requirement. And so I feel like this bill would take care of both of those. Is that correct?
So the 95% testing requirement, if I'm not mistaken, is that federal piece that we mentioned earlier, where it would require a waiver request from the Federal Department of Education. But to answer the first part of your question in terms of holding harmless for growth and accountability, that's correct. The bill takes care of that.
Okay, perfect. A question I have is if a school, because we had some of these conversations about schools and districts, because there are going to be very bright points. You know, there are going to be these very successful schools that even with all that they've been handed are going to be very successful. So would a school or district or teacher have the ability to take that growth or achievement if they so choose?
The answer is yes. Should it be available? Well, the answer is yes to this current testing data. Should it be available?
Okay, perfect. And normally in a regular year, a teacher would receive a level of effectiveness score. And normally, of course, that is calculated in various ways depending on what you teach and et cetera. So what will those look like this year?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And for those of us veterans who remember not too long ago, even in 2017, I think you'll recall in 17-18, just because of how all educators, their own unique situations are going to differ, there are going to be so many unique situations in terms of when you started teaching in Tennessee, whether you're tested or not, and then you have to consider what years, if you go back, do we have available data, coupled with the fact that some of these indicators like TVOS are calculated as a composite. The short answer to that is that the situation will just depend. But the important thing to understand is that when calculating LOE scores, like the intent of the bill and what will happen is that the scores will not be used to harm a teacher, and can be used if it benefits the teacher. So that would look different, of course, just depending on the situation. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And I know it's a complicated answer just because of the variety of ways different teachers are calculated. So, but I do appreciate the flexibility if a teacher is successful with a certain cohort that they would be able to use that. And if not, if there were another set of circumstances that were negative, then they wouldn't. So.
Sure, and I'll mention too here in this bill language that provision also extends in certain places when you read through it to school administrators as well.
Other questions for Jack or anybody else from the department? Well, thank you for being willing to do that, and I think we all look forward to this bill moving forward, as well as all the governor's special legislation on the education, and certainly some of us have seen the 360 roll out and are excited about that and early literacy. So thanks for what all the department is doing, and we look forward to continuing the collaboration with you.
Yep, certainly. And Chairman Evie, I just want to make sure to say thank you to you and Vice Chairman, all the other Vice Chairmen that I've bestowed the title upon at the meeting. Chairman Hartgrove, thank you also for the continued collaboration with the board. And I'll just echo, we're also very, very excited about what's coming up, especially related to Reading 360, and excited to hopefully be in a unified path forward in terms of literacy and other efforts. So thank you guys too. I just want to say, should there be follow-up questions, we're happy to help walk through bill language with folks related to the assessment and accountability bill. Just let Sarah or Amy know, and we can get you some more information as needed.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Jack.
Are there other items for discussion today with regard to testing and accountability that anyone else wants to bring up? Well, if there's none other, certainly as we look forward to what's coming forward, I'm not sure the time schedule for all this. We've got a board meeting in February. I'm not sure that at that point in time we'll have activities specific on this or not, but certainly I would expect in the early spring there very well could be some actions that the board will be required to take on the testing and accountability, and we may have to have another meeting for the subcommittee prior to that. Certainly, we ought to have one by June, if not before then. So, nothing else. Sarah, do you want to make any final comments?
Nothing more from me. Great discussion. Appreciate our partners at the Department of Education giving us such good information. And I agree, Bob. We'll stay in touch about sort of the schedule for the subcommittee moving forward and make sure that we're being responsive to the legislation and continuing to come together about these issues as they kind of unfold over the next few months.
Thank you. Again, thanks to Casey for outstanding presentation. I think that helped us all, and we look forward to it. And I'll adjourn this meeting. Meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.